Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thanks all for joining the MEED Summit today and for joining, staying up for this panel. I'm very pleased to be invited to moderate this panel discussion today, and very, very excited to hear from the excellent panelists we have. So the panel is about decarbonizing the transport sector. Very interesting topic and very timely for the region as well. With all what's happening all over the world, I think there's a lot of great steps the different MENA countries have been taking to decarbonize the transport sector among the other sectors as well. So we will speak today about some of the initiatives that have been taken and some of the projects and countries in the region. We'll speak about how EVs or new energy vehicles in general that are contributing to the decarbonization of the transport sector, how they make sense or they don't make sense within the regional context, and also talk about what needs to be done in terms of the different policies, in terms of also the private sector engagement to accelerate the decarbonization efforts of the transport sector. Just a quick introduction. My name is Ahmed Samir. I'm the Managing Director of the Clean Energy Business Council, CEBC. We are not-for-profit membership organization based out of Dubai, but we cover the Middle East and North Africa region, the MENA region. So what we do is our mission is to accelerate the policy maturity of the clean energy sector in the region. So we interact very closely with the government entities, and we act as the voice of our members, the private sector, when we speak to the government entities. We cover different topics. One of them is electric mobility, among other topics, such as energy efficiency, climate finance, green hydrogen, and energy storage. We have over 120 member companies from all over the MENA countries, and we have even some members from outside the region, but are interested in the region. And we work closely with the different government entities in the different MENA countries. You can visit our website. We do a lot of research that we publish as reports, case studies, white papers on different topics I mentioned. And very soon, within the coming 2 weeks, we'll be publishing our first white paper on electric mobility in the UAE, which was a result of a survey that we circulated with over 300 companies in the region. And we get responses which are very interesting. So I think this white paper is very highly recommended for anyone in the sector. So which means if you are listening to this panel today, then you should be interested in the paper. So we'll make sure that we share it with the MEED team once it's out. So without further ado, I would actually like to start the panel discussion today. So we'll first start with 3 different presentations from the 3 panel speakers we have. Then at the end, we'll have the Q&A part, which will be more of a discussion. So please do send your questions. We'll try to take as many as we can from these questions at the end. I think the platform is very easy to navigate, so you should be able to know where to ask the questions. I would like to start with Dr. Amro, who is a research fellow at KAPSARC. So Dr. Amro will give us a presentation about the carbon emissions and EV deployment, a power system perspective. This is very interesting, and please, everyone who's attending, pay attention well to this presentation, because this is a very tricky topic that a lot of people who actually advocate for EVs don't really focus on this. Would it really, like, looking at the topic as a whole, EV as part of the whole ecosystem or the whole system, does it really make sense? Because it might eventually mean that it does make sense, and we have to look at different decarbonization techniques. So please do pay attention well to this presentation, and over to you, Dr. Amro, for this interesting presentation.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Very briefly, as you mentioned, when you say or when you mention decarbonization of the EV sector, it's very difficult to decarbonize the transportation sector without looking at the power sector. Yes, the electric vehicle is carbon-free at the tailpipe, but if the energy is coming from a dirty energy source, then you might actually end up increasing total emissions. And generally, we want to look at the system as a whole, as you mentioned. I wouldn't call this a presentation. This is just a very, very brief overview of some of the work that we have done in KAPSARC, in King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, to have more of an interaction and to look at the interlinkages between the EV sector or the transportation sector and the power sector, which are considered one of the most polluting sectors worldwide. Very quickly, if you really want to be very fair and thorough in understanding emissions, especially with respect to the transportation sector, you have to look at so many things, so many factors. So as you can see on the left here, if you really want to quantify it accurately, you have to look at driving patterns and driving distances and efficiencies of the vehicles, etc. Of course, doing that is going to be very, very difficult and very lengthy. So what we have done in KAPSARC, one of the ideas that we came up with was, well, how about we just look at extreme cases? Let's look at the, best case scenario and the worst case scenario and see what happens. And as you can see on the right, what we've done is that, okay, how about we, retire all the four-cylinder cars, all the four-cylinder ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, and replace them. So this is the worst case scenario is just remove the very small ICE vehicles and replace them with the, very inefficient EVs, those who require 20 or 30 kilowatt hours, cents per kilowatt hour. And then the other side of the story would be, how about you retire all the 8-cylinder huge SUVs and then replace them with the most efficient EVs, those who require the least amount of kilowatt hour per kilometer. So that's an extreme. And then charge these EVs at the extremes, at off-peak hours and at the peak hours, and then assume perfect substitution. So assume that a person who drives an ICE vehicle would replace it with an EV. So if we look at that, so let's now move on and look at what do I mean by peak charging and off-peak charging. So the gray figure there is your base load. Any additional EVs introduced into the system will require additional energy. So the green additional sort of area is random charging. So people charging, you don't know when people would charge. So you would charge at any time, for example. But if you restrict the charging to peak time, that's going to be your yellow area. And if you restrict the charging to off-peak time, so very late at night when everybody is asleep, that's your off-peak limit. So as you can see, we're looking at the extremes, right? And then you move ahead and you look at basically the power sector from the viewpoint or from the lens of marginal generator or average generator. So if we just move to the next slide, please. Many people don't really pay attention to the actual generator that is satisfying the additional kilowatt hour that you need. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. So on the left, for example, this is just a hypothetical energy mix. Let's say that you have, a nuclear generator and a fossil generator, and so nuclear is carbon free, and let's assume that your fossil generator generates or emits 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated. You look at the right now. If any additional kilowatt hour is going to be charged, what's actually going to happen is that the fossil generator will meet the additional kilowatt hour. It's not the nuclear generator that's going to be meeting the additional kilowatt hour. So on the left, the average emission rate would be 0.5 kilograms, because you're taking the average between a carbon-free technology and a carbon-not-free technology. So you end up with 0.5 kilograms. You're taking the average, but the actual emissions will actually be 1 kilogram per kilowatt hour, because it is the fossil generator that's meeting the additional kilowatt hour. So in the analysis, we use the marginal method to calculate emissions, not the average method. The average method is good for high-level studies to get some sort of benchmarking, but if you really want to be accurate, you need to look at the marginal generator that is meeting the additional kilowatt hour. Now you look at that. Of course, we've done the study for Saudi Arabia, and if you look at the results, it depends actually. So in some cases, if you remove all the small ICE vehicles and replace them with with the EVs that require the most kilowatt hours, you actually end up with additional emissions. So the net effect on emissions will be an increase in emissions. At the other extreme, if you remove all the 8-cylinder cars and all the 8-cylinder SUVs and replace them with the best EVs, you will end up with a decrease in emissions. So that would be your best case scenario. The median, hopefully, what will happen, of course, is somewhere in between. So halfway in between will result in a reduction in emissions. So in conclusion, I would say that it's very important for all those who are working in the EV sector to think about the power sector. It's very important. The EV sector and the power sector are, it's just the same. It's two faces for the same bill. And so, for example, again, we understand that there are many companies and many policymakers that are calling for time of use charging and promoting different times of charging. That will be true depending on your energy mix. However, if your energy mix is the same, or if your power mix or your marginal generator is the same across the year, which is the case in many countries, actually we found that it does not matter. Changing the time of when you charge, we're talking from an emissions standpoint now, not from grid reliability or cost of charging or your reserve. No, we're strictly talking emissions. We found that for the case of Saudi Arabia, different time of charging does not significantly or considerably impact your emissions. So these are the key takeaways. In the Saudi context, on average, deploying EVs will result in a emission decrease. In some cases, if you're not careful, if you replace the most efficient and the less efficient, you'll get a net increase, and the time of charging doesn't necessarily matter. This is a very quick synopsis of the paper for any or one of the studies that we have conducted in KAPSARC. We have so many other studies. I encourage you to visit our website. We have a lot of analysis and a lot of studies about EVs in China, in the US, here in Saudi Arabia, gasoline prices, elasticities, etc. But this is just a very quick synopsis of a recent paper that was published. Thank you very much. Over back to you, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amro. And I think it's a very clear. That's exactly the reason why this panel is called Decarbonizing Transport, not electric vehicles, not hybrid vehicles. It's actually decarbonizing transport. So whatever are the different techniques to actually achieve that. And that's why it's also included in a conference that's talking about the decarbonization of the power sector, not just the transportation sector. I think that's the right context to have this discussion. So thank you again very much for the presentation. I just want to add also, we are working with KAPSARC as CBC in different projects. And one of the initiatives we did at CBC is the CBC MENA podcast. So it's something we started almost 5 months ago. And right now we are running a few episodes on the future of mobility, covering different topics, including electrification of transportation as well. So we had Dr. Wabal from KAPSARC, who will be speaking in the next episode on the podcast, which will be launched next week. You can find it on the SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. So I'll move now to Mark. So I think Mark always have an interesting insight to bring to the table. So I think he will talk to us about what are the different ways now to implement this commercially on the ground in terms of policies, in terms of the different business models to actually decarbonize the transportation sector. It doesn't have to be on vehicles, it could be different ways as well. So Mark, over to you now to start your intervention.
Good afternoon. Okay, we'll just really talk about electric vehicles in the main, from the point of view that today we see that what we see in the region is very different to what we're seeing in other parts of the world with the deployment of electric vehicles. If we can hold on a moment. So what we're looking at today is that we're faced with the point of that we're looking to switch to EVs. We see in a lot of Europe low emission areas, new government policies, various different corporate clients implementing different policies themselves. Just to give you an idea on what other governments are doing, and really what we see today, we've seen in 2019 the introduction of low emission zones in many major cities throughout Europe.
Yeah, so Karim is Chief Sustainability Officer at Diamond Developers. You might not know that Diamond Developers by the name, but of course, I'm sure you most likely heard of the Sustainable City in Dubai. One of the most promising projects that I have seen, and I had the pleasure to go and tour the Sustainable City many times, many futuristic projects that you wouldn't believe are happening in the world unless you actually go and visit and see. So, Karim, I think the main question you will answer, and very interested to hear your answer, is what is it only by introducing EVs? Is it only what are the different ways for the decarbonized transport when it comes to actually implementing this on the ground for the people, and how people are interacting with this? I think you have a lot of initiatives that you have started at the Sustainable City. So please tell us what you have over there.
Shukran. Thank you, Ahmed. Yes, a pleasure meeting also the fellow panelists. So in answering this question, I'm going to shift the conversation from an energy sector perspective to a community perspective, right? So we're going to look at the microcosmos of the future of mobility. And before I share the next 5 slides on what we have done and plan to do in Sustainable City in Dubai and in our other future developments, I thought I would just pull this up, which is really a reminder that mobility is about people moving from A to B. Ultimately, as a developer, as city planners, town planners, urban planners, we need to make it easy for people to move. That's what mobility is about. You know, before the machines came and before the Teslas came, it's really about moving from A to B. And so it is about understanding mobility and travel behavior. And this is really what I call an exercise in matchmaking, because every mode of transport or mobility has the appropriate use case. And we cannot apply all those solutions and technologies for any use case. So there is really some matchmaking involved. What you see here on this slide is really the relative weight, dead weight of various modes of transport compared to our body weight. So if I'm using a Segway or a bicycle, etc., perhaps I'm just adding 25% to my body weight. If I'm moving into micromobility, then obviously it's a little bit more. Light electric vehicles such as buggies and Tweezies, well, that's between 600 and 900% of my body weight. And ultimately electric cars, and then we can get into buses and metros as well. So let's remember when, and Ahmed, you rightfully said, Amro, you rightfully pointed out the SUVs, you know, gas guzzling SUVs. So an SUV compared to my body weight really makes no sense whatsoever in physics. So for us as developers, you know, we are planning future cities. We want to emphasize this person, the silhouette on the left. So we want to do everything to maximize walkability and bikeability, and then obviously entertain and accommodate other modes of transport to match specific use cases. So now I'm going to share with you a couple of experience on the next slide of what we have done in Sustainable City. So for us, mobility, it's really about embracing the future, right? So, and we need to accommodate smarter mobility. So we know that it boils down to electrification and car sharing and driverless, because all of that is happening, it is in the future. But equally important, we have to maximize walkability and bikeability, as I said. If you look at those pictures, so on the left, from an urban planning perspective, it really boils down to, can we walk, and where do we walk, and do we have enough shaded areas? So if we have a bad urban planning structure, it's very difficult to talk about the future of mobility. We have to, in this part of the world where we try to avoid the sun, we have to maximize shading. So in Sustainable City, we have narrow streets, we call them sikkas, 6 meters across. We have lightweight, light-colored paving to reflect sunlight and reduce the heat island effect. anything that we can do to enhance the thermal comfort and to improve walkability. We invite, of course, I invite my fellow panelists and any attendee today to visit the sustainable city. We have an open door policy, and we continue to improve what we have. Nothing is finite, nothing is perfect. We can continue to increase the ambition and become and move towards, a low carbon future. And so I was explaining what we have achieved so far in terms of maximizing walkability, providing a shared fleet of buggies that are geo-fenced, there we go, speed limited for commuting inside the community. And so people have a little access card, RFID card, and those buggies, that fleet, were able to monitor remotely. And so on the next slide, you will see a dashboard that operations has control of, and residents, fellow residents as well, they have an app and they can actually check the location of the nearest available buggy. So all of that makes it easy. We can expand this map 10 times or even 50 times. So we know that the technology is there for shared mobility, but I wanted to stress the importance of behavior change and light electric vehicles. In the next slide, I'm showing you also what is in the making. So from left to right, we have driverless transport. This is something we piloted with the RTA. This is the manufacturer is French, Easy Mile. And so basically you follow a designated route inside the sustainable city, and it stops at designated locations. And so we can now say it's tried and tested. It has its advantages. It also has many disadvantages. So driverless transport is very much about the first and the last mile. The question that begs itself, do we need driverless transport and where do we need it? The middle picture is sharing electric vehicles. So rather than encouraging all our residents to purchase or to switch from an ICE car to an EV car, how about we deploy a fleet of electric vehicles for the benefit of the residents? So these would be trip-based or station-based on a subscription basis. We're waiting for RTA approval to proceed, but this is something that we have been planning, and we have gauged the interest of our residents. There is a lot of interest to have access to electric vehicles rather than owning an electric vehicle. And on the right side, it is really, we're trying to move, and Dubai, I think, is hesitant when it comes to micromobility, because it is the opposite of a compact city. So we have large distances, but we have many finite communities and developments, from Business Bay to JBR to the sustainable city, where micromobility may or can make sense. However, as many European cities have experienced, micromobility is not without hassle. So it is about safety as well. There's a lot of hardware that needs to be replaced every 12 months. So we really have to think also about the carbon footprint of micromobility upstream, what we call embodied energy. And lastly, I have one more slide. There we go. And so at the sustainable city, to be able to accommodate and polish or improve, enhance mobility for the residents inside and outside, or inside and outside commutes, we've also established a business incubator, and this is licensed by Dubai SME. That business incubator is really about attracting, supporting, coaching, mentoring startups, entrepreneurs who have interesting solutions in sustainability, as well as, or including, mobility. A lot has come out from Bidayat, which in Arabic means the beginnings. And I wanted just to show that picture on the left, because this was probably the first virtual summit that we hosted back in March of 2020, just before the lockdown kicked in. And so this was a crash course in video conferencing, and this was organized by one of our fellow partners and incubatees at Bidayat called Generation E. What I wanted to say is that video conferencing is here to stay. We still have to improve it, as we just witnessed. However, we are able to avoid emissions linked to international travel. And we actually calculated how much we avoided from having that one conference hosted in Sustainable City virtually. And that was 150 tons of CO2, 1,500 tons of CO2. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karim. If you haven't been to the Sustainable City, anyone in the audience, please do. I'm sure you will be very much pleased with what you will see there. So thanks so much, Karim, again. And I want to move to Mark.
Right. Really, when we're looking at electric vehicles and the adoption of electric vehicles into the market, throughout the region. When we look at the differences between what we see for electric vehicles through Europe, which we have to say Europe at the moment and the US is very mature in its adoption of electric vehicles and the way it's moved. It's taken some time, we know, but we're starting to see that government policies now are driving electric vehicles to market. Also, the manufacturers are driving electric vehicles to market. When we take and look at what we've done or what has been done within Dubai 2017, there were a number of incentives that were introduced for electric vehicles. There hasn't been the number of incentives to really drive adoption. We have to ask ourselves a lot of questions is free parking, is free registration going to make you go and buy an electric vehicle, or is it going to make you drive an electric vehicle? Because there's a number of areas that when we look at with electric vehicles people don't understand electric vehicles. And today, I think you could speak to probably 5 out of 10 people, and the first thing they ask, the first question they ask is about the battery. How long does the battery last? So we're probably at a different stage as where some of the other countries have been. And what we've seen, as I said earlier before I lost, was the low emission zones that you've seen into major cities where there is high levels of pollution, and our health is one of the most important things, and decarbonisation plays a major part in obviously the reduction of pollution and our health. So what we saw in 2019, a number of major cities introduced that. Congestion charges, when I was in the UK 10 years ago, congestion charges in London were in place to try to prevent obviously people going in. At that time, electric vehicles weren't as popular as they are today. Diesel, as we well know, you can see as Paris will remove diesels in 2024. And they will remove ICE vehicles from Paris in 2030. We know that what we will see with other governments is that we see that the UK will introduce the removal of ICE, and they've moved it back from 2040 to 2035. Now 2030, the removal of ICE or the sale of ICE vehicles within the UK. So governments have started to drive this. Manufacturers have now understood that it's a time for we need to adapt, we need to move forward. We've seen over the past, we've seen this year already, GM announced that from 2035 they will only provide electric vehicles. Jaguar have announced from 2025 they will only provide electric vehicles.
So I think we can start with panel questions just to make use of the time, and in the meantime I think the other 2 slides that Mark has, we can cover them in the panel discussion, of course. So I just have a question for you, Dr. Amro, just relating to the topic of the whole summit today, which is decarbonization of the energy sector in general. So with all what has been announced from the different MENA countries in terms of the renewable energy projects, and in terms of there's a lot of mega projects with NEOM, with a lot of projects in the UAE as well. Do you think this will impact the study? Because what you mentioned now is based on the current power perspective with the current landscape. So with all of these projects connected to the grid, once they are connected, how do you see the impact of this on the overall results of such a study, like let's say 5-10 years away from today?
Yes, thank you, Ahmed. Of course, I think the concept of marginal generator and average emissions, so the marginal emissions and the average emissions, it's a very important concept to answer this question. So if there is a significant amount of renewables deployed, especially solar, of course, solar is very predictable. The area, the MENA region in general, the GCC, the Arabian Peninsula is very rich in solar irradiance. So it is natural to say, or somewhat automatic to say, that during the daytime, there will be a significant amount of renewable. Your marginal generator will be solar PV. So the additional kilowatt hour that is required to charge EVs will be coming from solar, and that will be carbon free. That's very good. However, you have the other side of the story, which is, well, now if we encourage people to charge their EVs during midday, that is probably your peak hour, that's your peak time, and that will somewhat stress your grid. So you need to think a little bit more about your reliability. You need to think a little bit more about your reserves. So from an emissions perspective, midday is a very good time to charge your EVs, because your solar is the output of solar is sort of maximum. However, it's also your peak load. So what will this mean? That the grid operator, the system operator, needs to make sure that the grid is reliable and he has enough reserves. So what does that mean? Well, that probably means that there will be overbuilding of solar, probably at a cost. This means that will be additional redundancies in your dispatchable generation. That's going to come at a cost. So there's this sweet spot where you need to balance between your emissions, and if you want to associate a cost with emissions, that's a different story. But to answer the question in 10 seconds, yes, additional renewables promotes less emissions in general at least the peak time, and especially for solar, but there's a cost that will be associated with the reliability and the grid, and straining the grid a little further because of the peak, the additional load that the system has to satisfy.
So much, Dr. That's very helpful. Okay. So Mark, I have a question for you then to cover the 2 points. I think there were a couple of slides that you couldn't cover. So the question for you, Mark, is we have seen, as you mentioned, the low emission zones and the zero emission zones are actually having direct impact on the decarbonization efforts for the transport sector in other countries. But we haven't seen any of these policies or any of the push towards like low emission and zero emission zones in the region. And I don't foresee that's coming anytime soon. So I don't know how you see this kind of policies that actually forcing the people to go to the specific choices or buy specific kind of vehicles. Do you see that happening in the region? If not, how? What are the other policies that you think the different governments in the MENA region should look at to accelerate the decarbonization effort in the region?
One of the interesting things that we've seen in the region is, and one of the next slide that I would have shown was the introduction of the CAFE regulations, which is the corporate average fuel economy regulation, which has driven a lot of people to electrification, because all OEMs have to now meet different emission standards, which become very stringent in Europe. So moving to electric vehicles is more favorable, even though obviously it's looked at with the amount of what you produce to build the vehicle is taken into consideration from that side of things. Within the region, Saudi Arabia introduced the CAFE in 2015, 2016, with the idea of reducing obviously the amount of oil and the amount of fuel, the emissions in that area through SEEP. Maybe we can see if it starts to be extended into other areas of the region, it will start to drive a change to, let's put it this way, a different mobility, because we're not seeing electric vehicles in Saudi Arabia. We have to accept that at the moment. We're seeing more hybrid vehicles because people are trying to find the balance to meet the CAFE target. But as the target curve increases, you need to increase the fuel economy. And with technologies today, it's very expensive to keep introducing different technologies when you can introduce electric vehicles from that point of view. So that's one area. The other area which will happen, which I have to think, but it's longer term, and that's probably more of the concerning point at this time, is that manufacturers will drive this anyway, because with other parts of the world, and we have to look at where manufacturers have to be profitable. Let's be honest, it's a business model. In other parts of the world where it goes to full electrification, is that you will see manufacturers are only going to produce electric vehicles, so the only available vehicles that will be in the region or be coming to the region will be more electrified. There is always going to be a need for ICE. I have to say that in some of the developing markets. If we go to Africa, we're not going to go in and put infrastructure, etc. But we have to bear that in mind at the moment. But I mean, I do believe that low emission zones could start to work in some of the region, especially if the government wants to get behind. It needs to be driven by government. You have to drive by government, and manufacturers and government need to come together on both of these points to be able to push this forward.
So much, Mark. And I think that last sentence you mentioned, the manufacturers and the government need to come together. I think it should be the overall private sector, not just the. I think even like we have seen initiatives from the Sustainable City. So I have a question for you, Karim, that builds on that. So I think it's very difficult usually for the private sector to justify such a projects that look at reducing emissions as the first goal of any project. So for you, I think Sustainable City is an ideal project that I think the ultimate goal was to reduce emissions. So what's the main motivation behind such a project? Like, was it mainly for financial reasons, for economical reasons, or it's only for environmental reasons? And how this is combined with that?
All of the above. So we have social reasons, we have environmental reasons, we have economic reasons for moving to low carbon and then zero emission. I confirm that back in 2013, when the Sustainable City was announced as a project, it was announced as a zero energy development. We haven't achieved it, but we are nearing it. So it's a target that's moving. I can confirm that last year in 2020, maybe due to the pandemic or despite the pandemic, we were net positive, so net energy positive in all the common areas. We achieved 117% renewable energy offset in the common areas. In the residential areas, we are at about between 40 and 50%. So why did we do this? Because one, climate change is telling us what to do. I don't think we have an option anymore. I'm not going to get into the climate change conversation. It is all over the news every single day, and it has only become more and more severe as time progresses. That's one. Two, socially speaking, so when we talk about low carbon and zero emissions, this has a huge benefit on people. I mean, the association between pollutants, air quality degradation, and lifestyle quality of life, autism, etc., is direct. The correlation is direct. And so if we can plan and operate cities and developments which are NIGO, and I like to say that we need to plan for car free, which is people first, and then zero emission, and then low emission, right? So if we think of concentric circles, at the heart, we have to be able to walk, and then we want zero emission, and then we want low emissions as we move out. So if we can plan for that, we will enhance the quality of life. A reflection of that is the economic benefit and output of our development. I can say today, I checked the numbers yesterday, occupancy in a sustainable city is at 94%. So that means we have 3,000 people living across 500 villas. No development in a large radius around the sustainable city can achieve those rates. So that occupancy is obviously the result of many features, including low carbon and zero emission. So I believe the incentives are there, right? The incentives, the benefits, the attractiveness, the visibility of going low carbon and zero energy is there.
Yeah, so before we go to the energy mix, I think on the one you just mentioned, Karim, I don't know how the people in the sustainable city are actually perceiving what you are doing. Because I'm trying to imagine the people who actually decide to go and live there have a specific lifestyle. And I have the question for you and Mark then. So how the people in the sustainable city, which is a community, are actually perceiving such transition? And that goes also to Mark. what else should be done from the government to actually support this kind of perception, which I'm sure it's different in the sustainable city? So Karim can start, then Mark can perhaps add to that.
I think that's an important point that I think we all tend to forget or we miss, which is what is my real commute needs, my commuting needs. We need to plan cities that are more compact for many, many reasons, right? So within a community, if we're able to create the jobs and provide the school and provide, you know, the outlets, the commercial outlets, then we create a small universe. And that small universe came to light and proved to be essential during the pandemic in 2020, and now we continue in 2021, because we need to be less dependent on long commute. We have to be able to support ourselves from energy and water and waste management and food security within a smaller radius. So in terms of people, I think we're noticing an uptake of people who appreciate less commute. If you have to spend 2 hours on the road every day, that's, you know, your day shrinks from 24 to 22, you're tired, you're stressed. If the children have to, you know, stand outside at 6:15 and wait for the bus because, you know, they're picked up first and then dropped off last, you know, they're going to sleep less as well. And so there are many social benefits and repercussions to long commutes, right? And so if we can provide all those services within a smaller space, we reduce that need for commuting. And people are appreciating that more and more. And on the point of car-free, so 80% of the sustainable city is car-free. And this was probably one of our unique selling points back in 2014. Yes, there were many skeptics, people saying, I want to park my car in the garage. But fine, you know, we don't have an offering for them, but we have an offering for all the other people who say, I'm happy to park the car far away and live in a space, in a neighborhood, in a village where my children can play out freely because, you know, they have taken over the streets and the sikas. So there are many social dimensions, social impacts of reducing commute, of walking more, of maximizing shading, and then spending less time in motorized transport.
Thanks, Karim. So, Mark, what needs to be done more?
It's a very interesting concept, and what he talks about is what on his slide, one of his slides was, which I think is very, very relevant today, is car sharing. You want to park your car in the garage. How long do you actually use that car per day? That's the question. Unfortunately, the pandemic came along and people were moving towards car share and it was becoming more and more popular, and suddenly everything's had to stop. But if you step back, and we will move forward for sure, and we're moving forward today, car sharing is really the next step forward and the way forward. Do you need to own a car and live in a sustainable city? If you can hire an electric vehicle, you can use it. You want to go to Mall of Emirates and come back, and you lose all of that ownership. You don't have to think about the insurance. You don't have to think about the servicing. Your life becomes a lot freer. And I think as we're moving forward now, people more in an urban conurbation are starting to think, do I need a car? No, I don't need a car. And car sharing is the way forward. You see on some of the things or some of the schemes that we have done in Europe with City, with electric car sharing throughout the whole of Paris. It's a way forward. And I think here, definitely in Dubai and across the region in the big cities, car sharing has got to be the next step forward. And why not with electric vehicle sharing? You leave the car at a post, so it's going to be charged for the next person to come along. If the infrastructure is in place, everything can really work well. But the infrastructure is part of the ecosystem. That's the one thing when you look into doing this, it's the complete eco-structure we have to take into consideration, because a lot of people think car sharing, we come along, it's just rent a car, move it from there to there, the connectivity you need, etc., etc. So when we look at this, I do firmly believe that an urban lifestyle as per a sustainable city is definitely the way forward, and it will grow. I think we'll see more communities move into this type of lifestyle, and car sharing can actually service that type of lifestyle without you needing to own the car. Do you really need to own the car? You spend 40 minutes in it a day. The other 23 hours, you don't spend anything, and it depreciates very much, as we all know. It's a large cost. And for what you really need to do from get to A to B. I'm hoping to see at Expo some very good car sharing prospects at Expo. That's what we really need to see to generate interest into this region.
Yeah, and I can tell you, Mark, from experience, I'm now finishing my 20th, and I never had a license. I never owned a car in my life, and
amazing.
I'm absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So I use public transportation when I'm in Dubai. I have my scooter, so I use it for last mile. So it's saving money, saving a lot of time, saving that you don't have to use like that. And again, it comes to the. I don't want to pivot from the topic of the discussion, but just quickly, it gives you some satisfaction because you're not using a resource that's actually allocated for someone else. Because the parking, if you are providing free parking or paid parking for someone, it has to be for everyone. And this basically comes from the tax that people pay, and only people who use for parking are the ones who have cars, but the others don't have cars, don't really use the public the parking, and that comes also to support the support for the public transportation, which has to be linked to equal to these people who are getting parking spaces. This equal money has to be spent on public transportation provided for those who don't have.
Allow me to jump in, Ahmed and Karim and Mark, and just. For our audience, because we are a biased group here. All what you're saying is nice, but let me tell you that there are people who love their big Ford F-150 Raptors. They want to live in a big house. They don't mind the commute of an hour. They don't care about EVs. They don't care about dolphins. They don't care about penguins. They don't mind the 1 hour commute. Cities like Beijing, New York, Toronto, London. I mean, it's very difficult. Yes, you can create a new community now where you have your own small universe with food security and your school and your supermarket, and everything is within 2, 3, 4, 5 minute drive. But again, just for the sake of being fair, and for those in the audience who are saying, yes, you have a bunch of, environmentalists and enthusiasts living in their own bubble. It is true, but it's very, very difficult. And I'm sure, we've been in this field for many years, and since 2005 and 2006, we've always heard that, the energy transition is 5-7 years away, and it has been 5 to 7 years away ever since. Nothing has happened. Renewable is going to rock the world in 2010. That didn't happen. EVs are going to take the world by storm in 2010. That didn't happen. Then they said in 2015, then it said in 2020, and we're still 5 to 7 years away. So again, yes, things can happen, things can change, but it's not easy. It's very, very difficult to sort of conquer this transition, as reality tells us. So just this in fairness to our audience, to know that yes, we are practical and we're not living in our own world.
But the SUVs are going electric as well, right?
Yeah.
So I think if it's one thing to talk about consumers and environmentalists and skeptics, yes, we demand, but who's supplying? So BlackRock recently made massive announcements around the world that they're shifting trillions of dollars from carbon-intensive industries to low-carbon industries, and those are the people managing almost societies and macroeconomics. And so if the likes of GM and BMW and Jaguar and make that shift, because there is a consumer shift, then it is moving. So maybe not in the next 4 to 7 years, but it is happening. It is happening.
Yeah, so I think we have like a couple of minutes. So I think you had a question for Dr. Amro Karim on the power sector. So we can have this one, and then I have one last question to close the panel with.
No, it was just the question of energy mix. And so we try to follow the same analysis. How can the energy mix also impact a community? So my question was related to, yes, how much of the EV charging relies on solar and versus the grid, and that grid is part of the utility. And what about microgrid? So to what extent will the microgrid landscape perhaps change as well that EV uptake and the marginal carbon footprint of electrification?
Very much, it would impact it, but at a cost. So there are studies, several actually, that so let's say that they expect, or they design this gas station or this EV station to be charged, and they assume 50 or 60 or 70 cars to be charged. Of course, depending whether you want it to be charged at 2 kilowatts or a fast charger, or all the discussion of CADIMOs and the different types. So you would need a solar PV, but solar PV is area hungry. So you need, you can have a small gas station on a small area footprint, but that's not necessarily true if you want to charge, if you want to have an EV charging station. What type of wind turbine? Yes, you have small scale wind turbines, 10 kilowatts, 20 kilowatts, but again, can you go through the zoning and all the permitting required? And then, of course, you have the question of storage. So it does help, but it is expensive. I mean, it's definitely not as cheap as being charged from the grid. And in 30 seconds, I'll just say that here in Saudi Arabia, I'm sure you've heard the new regulations that they have allowed investors to establish or build an EV charging station. So an investor would come in, he would buy the land, build an EV charging station, and it is an investment, and he would basically set the price. He would choose a selling price for what the electricity would be bought for in order for the customer to charge his EV, and the regulator would have sort of a cap price set. So it is available. It reduces stress of the grid, but we have to be fair. It's somewhat expensive, and of course the issue of range anxiety and time to charge. I mean, you can fill up your gasoline car with a minute or two. That's not necessarily true always for EVs.
That's good.
Thank you, Dr. Amro, and thanks, Mark and Karim. I think we had to conclude, despite all the technical issues. I think we had a great discussion. I wish we had more time, but just I think because there's another session should start soon. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks for the audience. And apologies that we couldn't take a few questions. I saw there are many questions on the chat here, but hopefully at next chance. I think the conclusion is the best way to decarbonize transport is to minimize transport, which is now we have seen this with COVID, almost emissions went very much down. So I think there's still a lot of things that need to be done on all the levels, from government, from private sector, from individuals, to be more conscious about the consumer consumption. So I think that's the main conclusion of this. So hopefully by the time we have the next panel, we'll see more sustainable cities. We'll see more people driving EVs. We see less people driving SUVs, as you mentioned, Dr. Amro, and we see these people are converting and changing their mindset, hopefully. So thanks again, everyone. And now we'd like to conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you.